Marlene and David Grissom, Professor of Social Studies here at City College. On behalf of the college and the history program, it is my distinct privilege to welcome you, whether virtually or in person, to this evening's discussion. Russia and Ukraine at war. Our discussion will be guided by Dr. Michael Ham, Professor Emeritus of History, and Dr. Sammy Swice, Visiting Assistant Professor of Arabic and History. A scholarly expert on Russia and Eastern Europe, Professor Ham's Kiev, a portrait 1800 to 1917 with Princeton University Press, was awarded the prestigious Antonovich Prize for the best book published on Ukraine. Ham has also edited and co-authored The City in Late Imperial Russia with Indiana University Press, and The City in Russian History with the University Press of Kentucky. He has published several articles, mostly on Kiev and Kharkiv and Russia's 1905 revolution. During his tenure at the college, Professor Ham received several grants for research abroad, including the American Philosophical Grant. He has worked as an international research and exchanges board scholar in the Soviet Union and has been a Fulbright researcher in Moscow. One of the first center professors to offer off-campus programs, he has led numerous center student groups to the Soviet Union and various Eastern European countries. Dr. Sammy Swice specializes in the history of Arab nationalism and trans-regional politics in the Arabian Peninsula during the 20th and 19th centuries. His dissertation with the University of Chicago focused on the political evolution of the Hashemite dynasty, a family of Arab Ottoman notables in Mecca, and examines the intersections of their imperial and cultural identities during the 1916 to 1918 Arab Revolt. As a respondent, Dr. Swice will enable us to think in comparative, cross-cutting ways about broader historical and Eurasian contexts. Dr. Ham will begin our evening with approximately 30 minutes of discussion, after which Dr. Swice will respond, then we will open the floor for question and answers. Thank you so much for coming, and please join me in welcoming Professor Ham.
This is indeed a very sad occasion. As we assemble here, rockets and missiles are falling on at least Kiev and Kharkiv, two big cities, biggest cities in Ukraine. The International Court is beginning to investigate war crimes. I believe the Russian economy is crumbling. Its financial system anyway is crumbling. And we are now experiencing a line of a 40-mile-long line of armored vehicles approaching the city of Kiev, attempting to encircle. This is a very dangerous situation, and not just for the unfortunate peoples of Ukraine. My job here will be to give you some context, some of the history. There's been, of course, a long-standing relationship between Russia and Ukraine. The word Ukraine, I think, comes from the Russian word krai, K-R-A-I, which means edge or frontier. It can also mean territory. The Russians and the Ukrainians are members of the Eastern Slavic group. There are 11 Slavic nations in Europe. The Eastern Slavs are the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Belarusians. The Western Slavs are the Poles, the Czechs, and the Slovaks. And the South Slavs are the Serbs, Croats, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and Slovenes. They were part of Yugoslavia until it back, what was it, the late 80s, early 90s. Linguistically, Russian and Ukrainian are very similar, not identical. Back in the day when I was doing research, I could read Russian pretty fluently. I had a great deal of difficulty reading Ukrainian and generally had to have help, particularly when I was dealing with sophisticated topics. I'm going to give you a little exercise here I don't want anybody from Eastern Europe to answer this. I'm going to give you some words, and I want you to see if you can identify them. You ready? I'm calling you. All right? I won't make you stand up. Siegen, Beauty, Bears, Beaten, Trabian, German, Beacon, Serpent, Jobten, Listopad, Root. Do you have any idea what I said? You sure? $1,000 rests on your answer. All right? Let me say what I just said in Russian, and you'll see the difference, and you'll all be able to understand. Yanvar, February, Marta, April, Mai, June, Yule, Augusta, September, October, Noyabra, and April. You all know this. So you see the difference. There are some significant differences. The Ukrainian ones, generally, the names generally refer to things out of nature. The Beaten, for example, has to do with the flowering in April. Traubin has to do with grass. Listopad in November has to do with falling leaves. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe outside of Russia. It is larger than France, Germany, Poland, Sweden, and Spain collectively. But it has a relatively small population, about 41 million. France, by contrast, has about 55 million. Germany, in excess of 80. It is also one of the poorest countries in Europe. If I were to give you statistics, and I'll give you a few, GDP per capita, or BPP, which is purchasing power per capita, Ireland, of the major countries, leads the way with a per capita GDP of about $89,000 a year. Norway, about $63,000, which is similar to the US. Germany, $51,000. France and the UK, both about $42,000. The EU average, $41,000. Italy and the Czech Republic, $39,000. Russia, $26,000. Serbia, $18,000. Ukraine, only $12,000. You can see a pretty significant difference there. Moreover, the Ukrainian population has been declining ever since the 1990s. Many reasons for this: emigration, the destructive effects of industrial pollution, high rates of smoking and alcohol abuse, but above all, a very low birth rate, one of the lowest birth rates in the world. In fact, birth rates all over Europe, with a few minor exceptions, excuse me, are very, very low. So the population continues to decline. I believe it's declining also in Russia. It has been for a while, for many of the same reasons. Ukraine is also one of the youngest countries in Europe. Aside from a brief fling at independence during the chaos of the Russian Revolution in 1917, 1819, Ukraine has never been independent, so that the Ukrainian state that you know today goes back only to 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed. Over time, Ukraine has been dominated by powerful neighbors. First, Poland, which was a great state in early modern European history, and then, of course, Russia. In the last census that I know of in Ukraine, Russians, the language of choice, about 30% of the Ukrainian population considered Russian their language of choice. Almost all of these people, who have a pointer? Almost all in the eastern part. You see Kharkiv there, you see Luhansk and Donetsk. These were the areas that the Russians occupied, sort of east of Kiev. That was a heavily Russian-speaking territory. Things are changing, of course, since Ukraine's been independent now since 1991, and the Ukrainian language is becoming more prominent, more popular. So much for the background. A word about the city of Kiev itself. First of all, and I noticed Juliana referred to it as Kiev, which is the Russian, and that's been very common. I have trouble saying Kiev, which is the Ukrainian, because I grew up at a time and did my research at a time when Kiev was the internationally accepted pronunciation. The Ukrainian spelling is K-Y-I-V. The Russian and formerly internationally accepted spelling was K-I-E-V. Kiev is a very important city historically, particularly for Russians and Ukrainians. It emerged in the 9th century as the organizing center of the first Eastern Slavic state. It was called Kievan Rus, R-U-S. At its zenith in the 11th century, Kievan Rus was the largest state in medieval Europe. Kiev itself, the city, had about 50,000 people. That's a big, big, big city by the standards of that time. Paris had about 50,000, London half that at that time. In the year 988, the Kievan prince, Vladimir, or Volodymyr, Ukrainian, accepted Christianity and brought his citizenry down to the local rivers and baptized them. So from that point, this part of the world, Kiev, Ukraine, became the eastern flank of Christendom rather than the northern flank of the expanding Islamic empires from the south. The famous monastery of the Caves was founded in 1051. It became and remains one of the most important pilgrimage sites for Christians, particularly in that part of the world. It is a beautiful monastery built into a series of caves along the right bank of the Dnieper River. Kiev is a very beautiful city. It is a city of hills and ravines, and it's along a very, very large river called Dnieper or Dnieper, depending upon your linguistic choice. Kievan Rus was subjected constantly to nomadic warrior raids that came across the Eurasian steppe. Well, I can't see it on this map, but the steppe, S-T-E-P-P-E, is that flat, short grass prairie that stretches from Mongolia and China all the way through southern Russia, Ukraine, and into Hungary and Romania. It is the traditional avenue of invasion of Asiatic peoples into Europe. In the year 1240, Kiev was sacked and destroyed by the Mongols. Batu, the Mongol leader, is said to have said, "I will tie Kiev to the tail of my horse." From that point, Kiev really did not recover very quickly, and in fact, remained a dusty frontier town for many centuries. But it became, during the Reformation, a hotbed of fighting between Orthodox Christians. You know perhaps that most of the peoples of Eastern Europe are Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, what have you. And Catholicism, supported by the very powerful state of Poland. In, I believe, the year 1596, I believe, yeah, a compromise religion was established called the Uniate Church, U-N-I-A-T-E, which retained the Slavonic language and the Orthodox liturgy, but which accepted the sovereignty of the Roman Pope. This, of course, was pushed by the Poles. In the 17th century, Kiev became the center of a bloodbath called in Ukrainian history the Ruin. This area, Ukraine, which is incidentally a very flat area by and large, again became the battlefield among Poles, Russians, Cossacks, who were the freebooters, the sort of democratic outlaws that lived on the frontier. A lot of them were freed serfs. And the Ottoman Turks that were moving in this direction. You may know from your study of history that the Ottoman Empire, the Islamic Empire of the Turks, ultimately conquered almost all of southeastern Europe, getting as far as Vienna at one point. And for many, many centuries, modern countries of Yugoslavia, what was Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, etc., were part of the Ottoman Empire. During this fracas, during the ruin, a Cossack leader by the name of Bogdan Khmelnytsky pledged allegiance to the Russian Tsar, Alexei, hoping to gain Russian support against the Ottoman Turks and the Poles. From this time, you have then this association between Ukraine and Russia, and progressively Russian domination of Ukraine. Okay. Incidentally, this warfare also included a Holocaust against Jews. Tens of thousands of Jews were slaughtered. If you were to have spoken to a Jew prior to the Nazi extermination of 6 million in the early 1940s and mentioned the word Holocaust, it would have referred probably back to this situation in Ukraine. It was a bloody nightmare. The people who counted, if you will, the nobility, the power structure, of course, tended to adopt the language of the state that controlled Ukraine. So that at this period of time, everybody, at least the people who counted, spoke Polish. Ukrainian language itself became identified as a language of backwardness, a language spoken only by peasants, by villagers, by rural people, by uneducated people. The 19th century, and really beginning earlier under Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century, Ukraine, at least the cities, the big cities, particularly Kiev, but also Kharkiv and Odessa, became thoroughly Russified. The Russian language was used as the language of government, the language of commerce, the language of education. In fact, after 1876, with the implementation of what was called the EMS Manifesto, EMS, Ukrainian language could not be published in any written form, nor could any school have in its library any Ukrainian material. So you couldn't publish a Bible in Ukrainian or a public health pamphlet or newspaper. That continued, was eased up a bit after the 1905 revolution. While Russian remained the language of the power structure, the language of the educated, and of course everything was published in Russian rather than Ukrainian, that made it easier for me when I did research because there was nothing really, very, very little in Ukrainian that I had to read. Almost everything was in Russian, a few things in Polish. But on the street, conversationally, I think in the big cities anyway, like Kiev and Kharkiv, you ended up having a kind of blend of languages. It's called Surshik. So that if you lived in Kiev in 1890 or 1900 or whatever, you might speak Russian, but a blend of Russian and Ukrainian, or possibly even some Polish. Although by that time, Polish had pretty much been extinguished. So, you know, these linguistic questions get very, very complicated over time. World War I. World War I was a disaster for the Tsarist Russian Empire, as it was for most of the combatant states. It's one of these wars that never should have happened, and it's a good example of how a minor event, in this case the assassination of the Habsburg Archduke in the most obscure part of Europe at that time, Sarajevo and Bosnia, how that escalated into a great power confrontation that literally changed the world and killed 9 million soldiers. During World War I, the great empires of Europe collapsed. The Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian or Habsburg monarchy, the Ottoman Empire, and the state system that you're familiar with, the map of Europe today, began to take shape, both in Europe and the Middle East, as successor states from these great empires took root. Poland, which had been partitioned out of existence at the end of the 18th century, was reestablished and enlarged. New states like Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Romania were created. In the Middle East, the British and the French carved their states out of the collapsed Ottoman Empire, so that states like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon took shape. But the Ukrainians did not get their own nation. And most of Ukraine was reincorporated back into what was now the Soviet Union, except for the western third. If I had a pointer, the area around Lviv, sort of west of where you see the end of the orange up there, that remained with Poland. And that today is the most Ukrainian and the most nationalistic part of Ukraine, of the three major regions. Ukraine didn't fare very well in Soviet times. One example, and a terrible example, in 1932-33, Stalin, Joseph Stalin, who was the dictator of the Soviet Union from 1927 until his death in 1953, confiscated so much food from Ukraine and imposed quotas on the collective farms that were so high that Ukrainians would literally starve to death. The number is about 4 million. This is known as the Ukrainian Holocaust. World War II, of course, Ukraine became a battlefield, as Juliana said. The Soviet Union lost millions and millions and millions of people. And Ukraine, of course, was one of the battlefield fronts. There were resistance movements in Ukraine against Stalin. They didn't amount to much over time. Kiev itself was occupied very quickly by the Nazis and was, before the gas chambers were built, most of which were constructed in Poland, became one of the most notorious killing fields for Jews. There is a place in Kiev called Babi Yar, or in Ukrainian Babin Yar, which at that time was a series of parks with a lot of ravines. In 2 days rather, in September 1941, 34,000 Jews were rounded up and simply shot in the back of the heads as they would fall into these ravines. So it was a place of great suffering. for the local Jewish population. Even in the 1980s, moving forward, when I took students to the Soviet Union and other Soviet bloc countries, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., we always started with a courier guide. In a particular year I'm thinking about, she came from Estonia, where we began our trek through the Soviet Union. The Baltic states, of course, at that point were part of the Soviet Union, having been annexed, like Western Ukraine was annexed by Russia, by the Soviet Union during World War II. When we got to Kiev, the first thing we did was to do a city tour, headed by a local guide. I was in the process of doing research for my book and articles. So during this bus tour of the city, I asked the local guide some very inoffensive questions, nothing political. I was very sensitive to what you should and should not say. They were simply questions about, well, wasn't this street called in Tsarist times so-and-so, so-and-so? That night, Larissa, our courier guide, came to my door, my hotel room, in tears. This was something the tourist guides were not supposed to do. They were not supposed to have any contact with foreigners other than what they were officially supposed to do as guides. And she said, Mikushka, she called me, she said, you've got to stop asking questions. And I said, well, I'm sorry, but I haven't really, I haven't asked anything sensitive. And she looked at me and she said, you don't understand, this is Kiev. Being in Kiev terrified her. Kiev had a reputation of being the most tightly controlled city in the Soviet Union, along with Riga and Latvia, outside of Russia itself. As the Soviet Union weakened and various national fronts began to form in the 80s against Moscow control, Ukraine was at the forefront, along with Estonia and the Soviet Republic of Georgia. And an organization called RUK, an acronym R-U-K-H, formed, initially demanding that the Russians, the Soviet government, set the historical record straight. That they treat honestly the abuse of Ukraine, particularly in the state-imposed famine that I mentioned in 1932-33. This was typical of these early national movements. They wanted honest and open the ability to honestly and openly study their own history. This quickly became a national movement, and when Gorbachev finally ended the Soviet Union in 1991, my wife Joanne and I went because this was a very historic event and we wanted to witness it. Inflation was raging. Shelves were empty, but there was a sense of genuine euphoria. Ukrainians were now free. And in a city where I couldn't even ask about the name of a street in Tsarist times, now I was asked to give a lecture on academic freedom and tenure. My wife was invited to speak at elementary school. She was an elementary school teacher and administrator at that time. can't tell you how euphoric people were. Interestingly, it was very hard to get to Kiev at Christmas in 1991. Aeroflot, Soviet airline, was barely flying because they could no longer afford the price of jet fuel. So it took us a long time to get into Kiev. We got in through Austrian Airlines. When we got to the airport, it was very late. The planes just sat on the tarmac, inoperable. The terminal was completely dark, except for two old women in the corners, one of whom was selling Barbie dolls, and the other one selling Kodak film. This was the first time I had ever seen American products like that on sale in the Soviet Union. You always had to prepay vouchers when you traveled to that part of the world, hotel vouchers, transport vouchers, etc. I had them with me, but the person who was supposed to meet me at the airport didn't show up. So we had to sort of risk just hiring someone off the street to take us into the city, which was about 25 miles away. And when we got there, the hotel that we had signed up for was now closed. And the woman working there said to me, "These vouchers aren't any good." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because they were issued in Leningrad." Leningrad is St. Petersburg today, Russia. We don't honor vouchers for Ukraine. Things had changed literally overnight. When I finally found another hotel, because I knew the city, I had been there a number of times, and as I was doing the paperwork checking in, I told my wife to go over, this was after midnight, and see if she could change some money so that we would have some money the next day as we wandered around the city. We had forgotten that the ruble, which had been pegged at 1.5 to the dollar, did not float against the American dollar or any other hard currency, had all of a sudden been set free. So that ruble was now like 5,000 to 1. So my wife whipped out $50, gave it to the woman at the cash register, and I saw her kind of swear under her breath. She went back and opened the safe and began to get out stacks of bills. You know how banks would wrap bills after they hit. I kid you not, we had like a suitcase. I was certain that we were going to get mugged because this hotel, where I generally stayed with students, was now full of Caucasian, Armenian, and Georgian fruit sellers and black marketeers who gave us the evil eye. Later, Professor Riegelman, him and I had mutual friends in Ukraine, and I told one of them to round up all of his friends, and I would take them out for dinner. There were 3 private restaurants in Kiev at that time. And we had dinner, and we had everything from caviar to the best vodka, et cetera, all the little vodka. And it came to something like, I don't know, 500,000 rubles or something like that, which amounted to $19. So that was my early experience. But people were optimistic, very optimistic. Why shouldn't they be? They were now free. However, things would go very bad, both in Ukraine and Russia, very quickly. As the Russian ruble collapsed in world money markets, and as Russian industries, Soviet industries that had never been allowed to compete in the outside world collapsed, thousands of people were laid off work. And hyperinflation, something you never want to experience, rose to a rate of about 10,000% a year. So the local currencies, the ruble, were essentially worthless, and anybody who had savings, of course, were wiped out because those passbook savings were not worth anything. This gave the opportunity to the power structure that had survived from Soviet times to buy up the assets of the country at bargain basement prices. These are called oligarchs, or Russians used to call them mafios. These are the people basically who surround Putin today. And Russia, and to some extent Ukraine, became like the Wild West of the United States in the 19th century, with oligarchs with their own militias fighting one another for turf, or for control over the aluminum industry, or over this bank, or over the copper mines, or whatever it was they were fighting. Okay. Not hyperinflation, but serious inflation again occurred in 1998. In 2004, Ukraine experienced its first, it's called a revolution. It's more like an insurrection. It is called the Orange Revolution because the demonstrators, and there were tens of thousands of them, wore orange. And they basically came out protesting rigged elections, abuse of power, censorship, lack of freedom. And it made a difference because it showed, if nothing else, the level of, the extent of resistance to the corrupt autocratic governments that were in power at that time. And the fact that Ukrainians were very capable of mobilizing the civil society. Interestingly, a new weapon was introduced here. It's called the cell phone and the internet. The demonstrators from one area to another coordinated all of this via cell phone and via internet. In 2013-14, a second, more substantial revolt is called the Euromaidan revolt. Maidan is the name of the main square in Kiev. What happened here, the Ukrainian president, named Yanukovych, was confronted with a choice between signing an agreement which would align Ukraine more closely with the European Union, which is what the Ukrainian people wanted, or aligning Ukraine more closely with Russia. He chose the latter under particular pressure from Putin at one time, at one point embargoed Russian goods, Ukrainian goods into Russia, threatened to cut off our gas supply. Yanukovych had to flee. He still lives in Russia. He's under indictment in Ukraine for treason. They allege that he ordered Russian troops in. From that point, I should say, and then it is after that that Putin decides to annex Crimea, which had been part of Ukraine. Oddly, Crimea had been given to Ukraine in the year 1954 by Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, celebrating the 300th anniversary. Remember I talked about the treaty in 1654 where Ukrainians pledged themselves to the Tsar Alexei. This was a gift. Now Putin took it back. And it was also at this time when he annexed, or not annexed, but occupied these two eastern provinces, which were heavily Russian-speaking. They're called the Donbass because the Don River flows through there. Donetsk and Luhansk. Okay. Again, you have here violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. Pretty serious violation of Ukrainian sovereignty. So I think that pretty much sums up the history of the situation. And when we have questions and answers, of course, I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that might come up. But let me draw just a few conclusions. And these are my own opinions. I don't represent any ethnicity or any organization. Based on what I can perceive from his rhetoric over time, I believe Putin is unwilling to acknowledge that Ukrainians are a separate nation and have the right to their own state. Secondly, the fact that Ukraine is democratic, Russia is not, threatens Putin. Autocrats are fearful of democracy. Notice Putin's only allies in the world come from places like North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, and maybe even China, although Xi in China is kind of defensible, it seems. Third, it seems that Mr. Putin has seriously miscalculated the level of resistance that he is experiencing in Ukraine. It seems that he believed that he could overrun this country quickly. This is not happening. He is moving, he is advancing bit by bit, but it's going to be a long and bloody affair before he occupies the country, and then he's going to face a very, very significant resistance. He also miscalculated the extent to which the West would hold together. You remember perhaps that Donald Trump talked about withdrawing American support for NATO. It's a very foolish thing to do, and he was talked out of it, unfortunately. It's American muscle that gives NATO heft. Well, what Putin has done is to revive NATO. It is now stronger than ever. And you can look at country to country, look at Germany, for example, which has always been reluctant to do anything that smacks of militarism. The Germans now are beginning to increase their defense capability. Remember, NATO is a defensive alliance. Having said all this, at this point in time, I am not in favor of allowing Ukraine to join NATO. I don't think it's in the cards. I don't think it would happen. Maybe down the road sometime when things settle down, if Russia does become democratic and things settle down, maybe it will happen. One better option might be for Ukraine to become neutral, like Austria and Finland did after World War II, so they could get Soviet troops out of their countries. Finally, while I'm not in a position to try to put a label on Putin's often irrational behavior, it seems to me that he is obsessed to the point of paranoia, both about NATO and the European Union. He is unpredictable, unstable. He reminds us often that he has nuclear weapons, which are now on high alert. He's a very dangerous man. I'm going to stop there and let Sammy retort, and then we can have Q&A.
I can breathe now. So I'm going to just be really, really brief. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for question and answers. But I was invited here today because my expertise is in Arab linguistics plus Middle East history. And we thought that, well, maybe there's something I can kind of contribute in terms of just some thought-provoking questions or issues to kind of illustrate how this particular issue, the war between Russia and Ukraine, have a global dimension and kind of cut through different cultural contexts. So what I'm going to present is just maybe some thoughts I have just kind of in the last couple of weeks, reading the news much like you have, now having listened to Professor Ham discuss sort of the historic nationalist and competing nationalist identities at play in the last couple of weeks. So the first, I'm constantly struck as I read the news, and actually interested in, because I'm interested in this question of how language informs national identity, about how myths of nationalisms from 2 centuries ago can still inspire people to violence. And that this violence, this nationalist violence of competing identities, are not just limited to Europe, but occur all throughout the world. Another issue that I've been kind of pondering, somewhat frustratingly actually, is how anxiety over non-renewable forms of energy still affect and frame conflicts and their solutions. So whether it's worries about Middle East oil, which I know quite a bit, or how the Russian gas pipelines to Western Europe, access to these forms of energy stubbornly guide global events. And that's something for us to kind of ponder and think about. Another issue that I'm thinking is I'm reminded that in terms of confronting a nuclear power, in this case Russia, or any nuclear power, or any state with a preponderance of military strength, the default strategies are often violent insurgencies and proxy wars. But now I'm also wondering, in recent events, if the political, economic, and even cultural sanctions that we're seeing being implemented against Russia could help mitigate the conflict. Hopefully avoiding some of the worst and more destructive tendencies of these types of wars. A fourth sort of issue that I'm noting. I can't help but suspect that sometimes a certain idea of race or racism can affect our understanding and tolerance of violence in some parts of the world and not others. So proxy wars and insurgencies abound in other regions, especially in places like the Middle East. But those have been wrongly accepted as natural and expected, and thus discounted, even though they are the product of very similar forces that we've been exploring and discussing today. And finally, as someone who likes to study technological mediums, and this is something I've been thinking a lot about the last week, just kind of consuming the same sorts of media that you probably are as well, that I'm curious to see how the role of social media will affect our understanding of the conflict. I'm sort of reminded that in 1853, so this is somewhat ironic, the Crimean War was the first systematically photographed war in human history. The Vietnam War in the mid-20th century was the first so-called televised war. The 2011 Arab Spring was a Twitter revolution. And this conflict, it seems, might be the first streamed war, which I have to credit Dr. Steve Baldwin for pointing at when I was discussing with him this idea. And so we have to ask, will the rise of this form of social media, TikTok, YouTube videos, as being a medium for our understanding and experience of this war, how will that affect how we make sense of it and ultimately see a solution? So I'll end it there. I hope that's enough. And we'll open the floor to Q&A. Thank you.
You all know, I think, that we are in a period of inflation caused a lot by the fact that we are now just beginning to recover from the pandemic, which shut so many things down, airlines, restaurants, etc. Inflation is going to get worse. It'll get really bad in Russia and Ukraine. But it's going to get worse in this country too, because for one thing, Russia is a major exporter of oil, second or third in the world. It's the major exporter of natural gas, and it's a major exporter of wheat, as is Ukraine. It's a major exporter of aluminum, palladium, copper, and some other metals. So, we already are experiencing a lot of disruption in the supply chains caused by a lot of things, the inability to recover from the pandemic quickly enough with all the ships out of the Pacific waiting for weeks or months before they can unload their cargo, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to get worse, but in this country, this is something we'll have to endure, and there are ways around that. I will say something about natural gas, because that's a big issue in this part of the world, unless you have a question first. Oh. Russia is a big exporter of natural gas, particularly to Europe. Most of the gas lines from Russia go through Ukraine. There is one, or maybe two, that come from Azerbaijan, I think, and go under the Baltic and then end up in Turkey. But most of Europe's gas comes from Russia, natural gas comes from Russia via Ukraine. They did construct what's called the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which runs from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. But that is not operational yet. It's finished in terms of construction, but the Germans have not yet allowed it to operate in terms of gas coming into Germany. So what does this mean for Europe? Well, for some European countries, particularly those that were part of the Soviet bloc, those that are closest to Ukraine and Russia, they rely heavily on Russian gas. Poland is one example, Estonia is another, Romania, Hungary, the Czech Republic. Germany, maybe 50% reliant. France, hardly at all. England, hardly at all. Spain, Sweden, not at all. So you don't have a uniform problem here across Europe. It's going to affect country by country. Also, the Europeans, like the United States, has a natural gas reserve, a strategic reserve. It's called the Cushion Reserve, which can be used in times of emergency. And nowadays, we and the Chinese send around the world so much liquefied natural gas that this could help compensate for a lot of the vaporized gas that comes through the pipelines. Liquefied natural gas is gas that is methane that is cooled to the point where it's liquefied, transported by ship, and then when it's used by the end user, reconverted into vapor, into gas. So again, I think to some extent the impact of gas and the ability of the Russians to cut off gas supplies, while it will hurt if they do that, it's also going to hurt Russia, of course, because Russia derives a great amount of its income from oil and natural gas sales. And Gazprom, which is the corporation that sells the gas, of course, like any organization, has contracts with its end users, with its consumers. And if they break that contract, those contracts are going to be penalties, financial penalties. So again, you hear a lot about the issue of gas. It is important. It probably, bottom line, probably reinforces the importance of Europe, not to mention the rest of the world, to move more quickly in the direction of renewable, non-carbon producing sources of energy. Questions, please? Yes, sir.
Dr. Hampton, how much do you believe that this war that we're seeing in Ukraine is influenced by economic strains from Russia, or Ukraine, having to pass gas through Ukraine, or what percentage of this do you think is war affected by the economic factors for Russia?
I have trouble hearing you because of the mask. I'm sorry.
So my question was, what was the economic?
How much do you believe the economic factors of Ukraine does Putin have to or has Putin put? How much do you believe that what I was trying to say is, like, how much do you believe that Putin may have caused this war because of economic factors?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. Russia and Ukraine historically have very, very tight and important economic relationships. Russia, again, exports much of its material to places like Ukraine and vice versa. So there is a very, very powerful, very strong economic relationship between the two countries. Now, how that will change as a result of the invasion, I guess your guess is as good as mine. With regard, again, to natural gas, China, of course, buys a lot of gas, but the pipeline from Russia to China is already full. And the pipelines that are under construction to China won't be ready for a number of years yet. So that's not really all that great an option for the Russians if they decide to cut out or curtail the gas flow from Russia into Europe. I don't know if that answered your question.
I was going to ask, I think the question he might have been asking is if Russia is trying to take Ukraine for its economic resources, specifically in...
No, I don't think. Russia is a resource-rich country. Russia does not need Ukrainian resources. This is more political and cultural. It's an effort to get rid of a democratic state on the flank of an autocratic state. And it's an effort to get rid of a state that does not believe has the right to exist because he does not believe Ukrainians are a separate people. Don't think it has anything to do with resources. Okay.
Go ahead, and then we'll come up here.
Russia benefits at all from this
I was
initiative?
speaking. Can I speak first, please?
Incidentally, before I try to answer your question, Liliana talked about the demonstrations in Russia. Let me tell you, it is difficult, dangerous to demonstrate in a police state. You're going to be arrested. You might lose your job. If you're a big enough fish, you might be killed. So those 6,500 people, and there'll be a lot more who have already been arrested, these are very brave people. We should commend them.
So let's go down here.
So from what you've taught us, it seems that Putin is very much culturally connected to Ukraine. It's kind of about cultural dominance. Could
Where are
you?
you? I don't see you.
I'm right here.
I hate masks. Go ahead.
As I was saying, it's a very much kind of like a dominance thing for him culturally. Could you be persuaded by his allies to kind of venture elsewhere after he gets what he wants from Ukraine? What do you personally? What do you think Putin's next move will be?
Well, I don't think he has any serious allies. I don't think the Chinese were, the Chinese and the Russians have a common interest in that they're both autocratic states, and they both fear democracy. China, of course, has its own problems with the Uyghurs and the persecution of that group. One of the questions that people are asking is if Putin isn't stopped in Ukraine, will he move forward? And I think that's the nature of your question, is it not?
Yes, sir.
If he does, that would be an extremely serious miscalculation, because then you're talking about invading NATO states. All of the adjacent states, with the exception of Finland, are NATO states. The Baltic states, Romania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, they're all nation states. I would seriously doubt that he would do that, but prediction is it's very speculative. Who knows? He doesn't think the way you and I do. Red shirt here.
I have a mic up here.
Oh, yeah.
Let me ask my question. So by no means when I pose this question by saying that invasion is justified by any means, but I think that it's important for us to question here where as NATO encroaches on Russia, how should we be taking Russia's own security considerations into account here? As NATO is moving in, you can see on the graph here, they're closing in on the border of Russia, and it seems that Belarus and Ukraine are the last stops before NATO is on the border of Russia itself.
You remember the last point I made. I don't, right now, support the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. And I don't think a lot of the NATO countries would support it either. It's a pipe dream. NATO is a defensive alliance. Or maybe sometime down the road, certainly not in my lifetime, where if If Russia becomes democratic and moves out of Ukraine, etc., things might change. But I think Putin is obsessed with NATO. You're right, NATO has moved to the borders of what used to be the Soviet Union. All of those countries except for Finland are members of NATO, but this is a defensive alliance. Now, to move NATO further, I don't support, and I don't think there's any real support among the NATO countries or the American government to do that, if that answers you. Yes, ma'am, black shirt.
I'm not going to bother with the microphone, I'll just talk loud. So I don't think anybody's surprised about any military resistance, but we've all seen and heard about almost like personal acts of resistance by Ukrainian military and civilians. And I've not seen that covered in any other war or conflict. And we've heard things like, take these seeds and put them in your pockets, at least sunflowers will grow and you'll die here, and the fight is here, anything ammunition not arrive. And that's made me really wonder about national identity, because I don't know much about Ukraine. You know Ukraine?
I'm not hearing you, I'm sorry.
Could you finish the statement?
What?
Can you finish the statement?
Yeah, sure. I don't really know much about Ukraine or the Ukrainian people, so it's really had me curious about national identity. Would you say this represents the Ukrainian people and like how they view themselves?
That one in particular represents the Ukrainian people.
How they've been really like personally defiant, saying things like, I think Zelensky said, the fight is here, I need ammunition not arrive. There was that island that said Russian warship, go F yourself.
So it's a question about to what extent is the political and military resistance and uprising in Ukraine shaped by Ukrainian identity and the attempt to resurrect and to double down on Ukrainian resistance have understood the question.
You know, a few years ago, before Putin began to put so much pressure on Ukraine, if you looked at the polls, huge number of Ukrainians, 80, 90%, had very favorable opinions about Russians and Russia, and I think vice versa. That, of course, began to change as Putin began to put pressure on Ukraine. As for the resistance, yes, I think Ukrainians are very proud of their country. They want to maintain their independence. They want to maintain their freedom. They know that if Putin overthrows the government in Kiev, which appears to be his intent, those freedoms are going to be eroded, if not lost completely. Ukrainian nationalism, which really used to be centered more in the West, the area that had been part of Poland, wasn't taken over by the Soviet Union until World War II. Ukrainian national identity and nationalism has really flourished, particularly, I think, since 2014, and I talked about the Maidan Revolution. So yeah, I mean, these people are very proud of their country, and they're going to fight. They probably won't win, but it's going to be, they're going to make it bloody as hell.
Let's go over here, and then we'll come over here.
Thank you for the lecture. So my question is, it's evident from the last 2 decades that, and every time a crisis like this happens, that the hate usually goes towards the people of the country. For example, after post 9/11, we saw hatred towards Muslims and Arabs in general, and then in COVID, we saw hatred towards Chinese people in general. And after this case, probably we're going to see rising hatred against the Russian people. What is the best possible way to tackle that?
I'm not aware of massive anti-Russian sentiment in the United States. I think people are appalled by what Putin's doing, but I think for most Americans this is a long way off. And I think they're probably a little scared when Putin raises the nuclear option, et cetera, as well they should be. But I don't see any great groundswell in this country of anti-Russian sentiment. And I think people realize that while Putin may be malevolent, that doesn't mean the Russian people are political. You know, you have to separate the actions of an autocrat from the population as a whole. So I don't really sense any, and I seriously doubt, as long as this is confined to Ukraine, I seriously doubt that you're going to see any significant rise in anti-Russian sentiment in this country.
So I have a follow-up question to that. Do you think that is because of racism ingrained in the Western nations in general? Because we often see that in places or peoples of other races.
Well, first of all, Russians are not a regular race, so racism has nothing to do with this. With regard to attitudes toward China, yeah, I think under the last administration, you could argue that some of the comments and some of the policies tinged racism, calling COVID to come through, whatever, that kind of thing. But again, if I understood your question correctly, in the Middle East situation is different altogether too, because we have in this country a very large Jewish population. We have a considerable Arab population too. And Israel means a lot to a lot of people in this country. So I think they're entirely different situations. So I don't think racism has anything to do with our attitudes toward Russia or Ukraine. For one thing, we're members of the same race.
Let's get one final question.
So this is sort of turning away from all that, but what do you think is mostly contributing to the logistical problems that the Russian military have been having as they've entered into Ukraine, other than obviously Putin just really severely underestimating the amount of resistance he'll come across as he moves into Ukraine and tries to take Kyiv?
That's a good question. I'm not a military expert, but clearly, you know, Putin marshaled up an army of about 190,000 men. Nobody in this country that I know, nobody in a position to understand this kind of military officials, nobody felt that that was sufficient to subdue Ukraine, which again reinforces to me the idea that he thought this would be over quickly and easily, right? I think we made the same mistake in Iraq. As to the logistical problems, you know, again, I understand that there's been a lot of breakdowns of their equipment. That happens, you know. Any military man will tell you that, you know, things go wrong in war, and I don't know whether the breakdowns of Russian equipment are anything other than what normally occurs in combat. I just don't know. I can't answer that question, but it's a good one, and obviously Putin must be terribly disappointed in the performance of his army. And what's going to happen? He's going to bring more troops in, more weapons, and it's going to be bloodier as a result. Because I don't think he's going to quit until he has what he wants. I hope I'm wrong.
Thank you. That's a lovely
So we run a quarter past, so if you would just join me again.